Imagine you're sitting in a dark room with an antiquated ticker tape machine clicking out a thin stream of paper, and on that paper are codes B1L, S2S, FOLF, DP. This is shorthand for baseball plays on the field. B1L, ball one low, S2S, strike two swing, fly out left field, double play. And it goes on like this. 2 innings worth of bare description with hardly any context. And what are you supposed to do with this slip of paper? Turn around, speak live into a microphone, and to an audience of thousands, tens of thousands of people, create a fully dimensional baseball game from these bare facts. This is baseball recreation, a unique phenomenon that swept the nation and is now mostly forgotten. Before we get to some of the fun, fascinating stories of baseball recreation, including the role it played in kickstarting the career of future actor and president Ronald Reagan, it's helpful to understand where baseball recreation came from, a hole that needed filling. Take a moment to consider the Marvel superhero franchise. All of those superhero movies and sequel after sequel, raking in hundreds of millions of dollars, which goes to the popularity of these films and characters for children and adults around the world. Now think of sports and how popular sports are today. Football, basketball, baseball, hockey, soccer, tennis. Now think about sports programming on television, ESPN, and social media. How people are, in many ways, addicted to all of these things. Now put them all together, and you have baseball in America in the 1920s. You have a country trying to heal after a traumatizing global conflict so big it was known as the Great War. You have a country trying to heal after the devastating Black Sox scandal of 1919 that was seen as a betrayal to the American baseball fan. People wanted distraction. They wanted heroes to cheer for and believe in. And out of this darkness, like Superman bursting through the clouds, came Babe Ruth. And with Ruth, the game of baseball changed. The spitball was banned. Power overtook speed and contact for dominance in the game. And this new invention of radio helped spread the fame of the first sports celebrities of the 20th century. But to get a better idea of what baseball meant to Americans in the 1920s, we have to hone in on one date, April 18th, 1923. This was the day that Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, opened to the public. This day, according to Smithsonian writer Vince Guerrieri, was, quote, nothing short of a coronation, end quote. By 1923, Ruth was a bona fide star, blowing away the record books for the last 4 years. Before Yankee Stadium, the Yankees shared their home games with the Brooklyn Dodgers at the Polo Grounds. Now they had their own field. And that first day, 74,200 fans piled into the stadium to witness American royalty. This is a huge crowd even today, but according to museum curator Brian Richards, that crowd size was, quote, beyond comprehension in those days, end quote. So 74,000 fans was beyond comprehension, and yet an additional 25,000 fans were turned away at the gate. And of course, that day, Babe Ruth christened the stadium with the first home run in the park. The Yankees bet big on Babe Ruth, and he came through 1,000 times over. They invested heavily in Ruth, including building a stadium that elevated the game. According to Vince Guerrieri, quote, terracotta carvings of eagles over crossed baseball bats adorn the exterior, and inside, along the upper deck, copper friezes lent the stadium what Yankees owners described as an air of dignity, end quote. But what happened after these lucky fans witnessed the magic and majesty of Yankee Stadium and Babe Ruth? They shared their experiences with friends and family, who then passed on the mythology throughout their towns and cities, spreading the miraculous sights and sounds and accomplishments from one end of the country to another. The decade of Babe Ruth and the Yankees was known generally as the Roaring Twenties in America and the Golden Age of baseball. It was prosperous for upper and middle class citizens, but there were still hard times for millions, for immigrants struggling to fit in, for African Americans not only discriminated against, but hunted by Ku Klux Klan members. But Babe Ruth and Rogers Hornsby and Lou Gehrig and Ty Cobb and baseball, these were stories that united everyone, no matter their background. Children who didn't fit in could bond over their home teams. And remember, this was the decade of prohibition. People could not easily turn to alcohol to numb their feelings and anxieties about the world and their everyday lives, but they could distract themselves with baseball. Year after year, radio and telegraph and newspapers grew, leading to more quantity and quality when it came to covering the game. Babe Ruth continued to perform throughout the 20s, and the Yankees became a dynasty. You had the incredible 7-game World Series between the Yankees and Cardinals in 1926, with the game ending in the bottom of the ninth with Babe Ruth inexplicably trying to steal second with 2 outs and down by a run. You had in 1927 the famous home run race between Ruth and Gehrig, with Ruth not only besting Gehrig, but besting himself by posting an incredible 60 home runs that year. For millions of Americans, for millions of children in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, baseball was everything. And yet, there was a problem. Ball clubs didn't want to pay their radio broadcasters on the road, and you had baseball fans in remote areas of the country who had no access to radio broadcasts. It's astounding today to see how owners and stations didn't see the advantage of spending that extra money to have a broadcaster at the game with the necessary equipment. This was the case for decades. So what do you do when you have millions of fans craving to experience Major League Baseball live? When you have millions of fans wanting to connect with their heroes? Well, if you're a creative, clever radio broadcaster, you pay a telegrapher a few bucks to go to the game with his equipment, who sends you inning by inning updates, and then you take those ingredients and you whip up 2 hours of sports magic. You give people what they didn't know they want, what they didn't know they could have. And it turns out they can't get enough of it. Tonight, I step into the time machine, and with all the tools at my disposal, I breathe life back into the long-dead phenomenon of baseball recreation. From historic milestones
That did it! Holy cow! A strikeout gets his 300th career win, and I tell you, this is...
to euphoric moments shared by millions,
In a year that has been so improbable, the impossible has happened.
to the simple banter that brought us together,
It's about Malachi with the call. I love that name.
It's a good name.
When you and I have a child together, we should name it Malachi.
Welcome to the Midnight Library of Baseball, Season 4, the broadcast that raised us, from radio to television and beyond. I'm Ben Orlando. In 1921, for the first broadcast World Series, a 37-year-old man named Tommy Cohen sat in a tin shack on the roof of the Newark Westinghouse building, receiving telephone messages from someone at the polo grounds watching and recording the bare bones facts of the game. So Cohen did not even have that piece of paper. He had to listen to the basic information and then recreate the game for his radio audience. Years later, announcer Ken Coleman tried to explain how difficult a task this would have been. From Coleman, quote, guys like Cohen, they didn't even have a scrap of paper to work from. No scorecards, no press guides, no spotters, no statistics, nothing. All they had were their ears, and even more than that, their brains. It put such an emphasis on imagination. End quote. It wasn't long before announcers were able to broadcast from the actual games, watching the action and describing what they were seeing right into the microphone. But the demand for radio broadcasts across the country outpaced the ability of radio stations to send announcers to the games. If you're in Omaha, Nebraska, or Billings, Montana, you're not paying a guy to travel to Chicago. It was too difficult and too expensive. But what you could do was have a guy in a low budget station with a telegraph machine creating a ball game out of almost nothing. In the 1920s and 30s, the exploding demand hit up against the limits of technology. And this strange confluence of events led to a new subculture in this already new medium. When I think about the era of the recreated ball game, I think about magic acts and the illusion. Because in a magic act, most of the people watching know it's an illusion. But there are a few, many of them children, who don't know or don't believe it's an illusion. They believe it's real. There was a similar dynamic in baseball recreation. Now, I'm always going on about what was inevitable in history and what wasn't. With recreations, I'm not sure. Because, yes, it was there from the start in 1921. But the recreated ball game didn't really take off for years. It wasn't until 1929, 8 years later, when a broadcaster named Charles Carroll changed his name to Pat Flanagan for his Chicago Irish listeners, talk about illusion, and recreated games from time to time. Flanagan and other announcers like him used the Western Union simplex machine, which made it easier for a man at the ballpark to transmit scores and basic game information. Before, you had to type out dots and dashes on the telegraph, and that's what came out on the other side. Now, with the Western Union simplex machine, you typed on a keyboard on the sending side, and on the receiving side end, you got actual characters, letters. To our modern standards, it seems like a lot of work, but at the time, it was a technological breakthrough. So Flanagan would get the information, and like Tommy Cohen 8 years earlier, he'd recreate the game to his listeners, as if he were right there at the park, watching every play. In his book, Memories from the Microphone, author Kurt Smith gets into the details of what this looked like. Pat Flanagan would have received ticker tape printouts of codes. For instance, B1L meant ball one low, S2C meant strike two called. So just imagine a stream of ribbon like paper filled with these codes. I think of that scene from The Matrix when Neo is talking to Cypher and they're staring at the codes streaming down the computer screen. And Cypher says, I don't even see the code. All I see is blonde, brunette, redhead. I imagine after a while, Pat Flanagan doesn't see B1L or S2C. He sees the batter swinging at strike three and slamming his bat to the ground. Or he sees the shortstop diving for the ball, flipping it to second, the second baseman leaping over the runner to turn a magnificent double play. The facts are facts, but in the vast unknown that's left unsaid, it's a choose your own adventure. And for Pat Flanagan, the sky was the limit. Now, Flanagan had done a few of these recreations off and on, but in 1929, one day, he asked his radio audience, "Hey, if you like these, can you let me know?" And guess what? 9,000 people wrote in and said they did. They said they wanted more recreations. 9,000 letters to a radio guy in 1929 is a heck of a lot of people, which showed that demand for lively play by play was off the charts. I'm trying to think of something that went from being a luxury to suddenly possible for millions of people. Take your pick: indoor plumbing, telephones, electricity. These are all game changers in society. These inventions that suddenly became accessible created convenience and allowed people more time to do other things. These inventions allowed people to connect with others, to learn more about the world. And baseball recreation allowed millions access to their favorite thing in the world. It allowed them to follow their heroes, to celebrate wins and mourn losses in the moment. This is what those 9,000 letters meant coming in to Pat Flanagan. So Flanagan set to work, and he upped his game. He used a wooden stick to simulate the crack of a bat. He had a soundtrack with hecklers,
Come on, get your eyes checked.
vendors shouting what they had for sale,
Cracker Jacks, get your Cracker Jacks.
fans clapping. By 1936, 13 major league teams recreated their away games. And for hundreds of stations across the country, recreations were their bread and butter. You're getting a lot of recreations for two reasons. One, it wasn't economical at the time to send hometown reporters on the road. Two, you have so many radio stations springing up on the outskirts of major cities, or far, far from major cities. So their only option, if they wanted to bring a game to their listeners, was to recreate. And think about where most Americans lived at this time: outside cities, or in cities and towns that had no major league club. According to writer Byron Sam, recreation was, quote, at the very heart of baseball on radio. Recreations planted the seeds of our coverage. They were the nectar from which most listeners drank, end quote. Just think of the country and Major League Baseball at this time. Remember, night games didn't exist, so baseball games were played when the vast majority of the country was working, when women were mostly at home, and children were at school. They couldn't go to the games. But now, with radio and baseball recreation, there's much more accessibility. And think about it. No doubt you have those people who can catch the recreations, then recreating the games again for others who had to work. I can just see these men and women at home in small town communities, listening to a recreation and jotting down notes in their notepads, which they then use to recreate the games for friends and family. What a communal experience this would have been. Many of you ask from time to time how I come up with my episode ideas. Well, I get into my process and the episode that came out of it in my latest Extra Innings episode, titled Recreation versus Santa Claus. You can become a Patreon member for as little as $5 a month and gain access to a handful of episodes only available on Patreon and iTunes through subscription. You'll also have access to some of my favorite baseball books, more information about my shows, and full interviews with some fascinating guests. Not only will membership get you these things, but it also helps to support the show, and it helps me grow and provide more quality content more quickly. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. Also, if you like the show, please leave a review on iTunes. This really helps the algorithms and the podcast show up for people who might enjoy it. Thanks again for all your help. Now, back to the show. Amid the many up-and-coming broadcasters at fledgling stations across the country, there was one young man at a station, WHO, in Des Moines, Iowa, with a knack for creating grand illusions in his recreations as he broadcast Chicago Cubs games.
There was a window here. Curly Waddell was the operator, sat on that side, and with the headphones, and he would type and slip it under the window to me. And they used to keep track because there'd be 7 or 8 stations competing and broadcasting, and most of them live right at the park. And we were within a half a pitch of right up with the live ball game all the time.
This, of course, is Ronald Reagan. Now, there were 2 types of recreators: those who did their best to fool the audience, to create the illusion that he was there at the game, telling you exactly what he saw. That was Ronald Reagan. But the other type was famed broadcaster Red Barber.
This is the old redhead, Red Barber, saying hi, hello to you, and Connie Desmond will be along here in a few minutes. Between the two of us, we'll send you the play-by-play. And your seat
Who considered it a sin to lie in any way about what he was doing. According to Barber, who did his fair share of recreations, it was dishonest to try and fool the fans. Barber said about recreators like Reagan, quote, "They didn't tell their listeners this was a game based on cold type. They'd jazz it up. They'd pretend. They'd try to convince their audience that it was all real, that they were somehow at the ballpark." End quote. Barber, on the other hand, always kept the sounds of the wire service close to his microphone, so listeners could hear the codes printing out in front of him. If you were good enough, Barber thought, it didn't matter if the audience knew it wasn't live. Well, Ronald Reagan had a different take. According to him, sometimes 5 or 6 stations recreated the same game, so they had to compete for one audience. They had to entertain. From Reagan, quote, "I'd get something that said SIC from the telegraph. And you can't sell many Wheaties if you just yell SIC. So I would say, Dean comes out of the windup. Here comes the pitch. And it's a strike breaking over the outside corner to a batter that likes the ball a little higher." End quote. And once, Reagan had to take this improvisation to the next level. Here's Reagan in 1984 telling the story of what happened.
It was the 9th inning, the Cards and the Cubs, tied up 0-0. And he was typing, and I thought there's a play coming, and he kept shaking his head when I had, and it was Dean on the mound, and I had Billy Jurgis at the plate. And I had him getting his sign from the catcher, and finally, here comes the slip of paper, and it said the wires have gone dead. And I knew in that 9th inning, if I suddenly said, well, we'll have a little interlude of music while we get back connected with the ballpark, we'd lose they'd all turn on some of those other stations. So I thought there's only one thing that doesn't get in the scorebook, foul balls. So I had Jurgis foul one, and then I had him foul another, and then I had him foul one that missed a home run by a foot. Then I described 2 kids down back at third base that were in a fight over the ball that had gone into the stands. And pretty soon I know I'm beginning to set a world record for somebody standing at the plate and hitting successive fouls, if anyone ever kept those figures. And I was beginning to sweat a little because I knew now that if I told them we'd lost the wire, they'd know hadn't been telling the truth.
Who finally did get the hit in that game?
Well, just pretty soon, Curly started typing, and I had him throw another pitch, and in came the slip, and then I started giggling. I had trouble getting it out because the slip said Jurgis popped out on the first ball pitch.
That's good.
Years later, Reagan had a final thought on the incident when he said, quote, "Making things up, mixing fact and fiction, what great preparation for politics." End quote. And so there were two camps. One read Barber, who tried to be transparent and let listeners know he was recreating. Then there were the broadcasters like Ronald Reagan, who tried their best to fool their listeners into believing the whole thing was real. When I read about these two men, the different kinds of recreators, I had to say I sided more with Ronald Reagan. It just seems like Barber was too extreme. It's not like when you go to a movie, you need someone every few minutes telling you, hey, just remember, this isn't real. These are actors. Just remember. That's what it seems like Barber is doing with the ticker tape sound always in the background. Once listeners know you're not at the ballpark, go to town. Spin the best illusion you can. Because once you tell the listener the truth, it becomes a partnership. You're both working to create this three-dimensional world. But this isn't like listening to a radio drama or watching a movie. A recreation is based on real events happening in real time. But the nuances are up for grabs. They're partly shaped by the announcer and partly shaped by the mind of the listener. And strangely enough, there was a third type of broadcaster, the one who turned recreations into its own entertainment form. Maybe the best known from this group was Arch MacDonald. A longtime announcer for the Washington Senators, Arch MacDonald commentated for the Senators from 1934 to 1939. And then he went to the Yankees, but soon he returned to his hometown. For home games, commentators would announce from the ballpark, but many resorted to recreating during away games. And this is what Arch MacDonald did, working upstairs of a drugstore. From sports editor Shirley Povich, quote, he'd be up on the second floor, 3 blocks from the White House. People would crowd around the store on the sidewalk. And as he broadcast, sweating up a storm, they'd roar, end quote. So here's this guy simply taking the notes of the game and recreating it live. And people are loving it. Later, McDonald moved his operation into the basement of that drugstore building, where they assembled bleachers on all sides surrounding a glass wall. And inside there was a booth. McDonald's son remembered, quote, Dad would stand in the middle with the Western Union operator sitting next to him. And as the signals came in from the away ballpark, he'd restage the game. He always stayed about an inning behind in case the wires went dead, end quote. McDonald's son continued, quote, Dad would be all set to go, and he'd look out at the bleachers, and they'd be filled. People would stand in line to come in, have a seat, and watch Dad and the Senators roll, end quote. Among other props, McDonald used a gong on set, hitting it once for every base. So a homer was 4 gongs. He pretty much did whatever he wanted, which was the way radio announcers of ball games innovated. According to sports writer Ken Smith, these original broadcasters were on their own. They didn't have teams behind them. They didn't have producers. So they got creative, and this led to outspoken personalities of the time. Even after television started to take off, recreated ball games persisted through the 1940s and 50s, until 1955, when a court ruling forced stations to pay franchises to recreate games, which led to this strange and wonderful art form finally giving way to the modern world. In episode 1 of this season, I wrote a love letter to Phil Rizzuto. Well, a few years ago, journalist and diehard Giants fan Bob Mason wrote a love letter to a broadcaster named Les Kiter, who saved Mason and thousands of other fans through the act of baseball recreation. In 1957, Bob Mason was 10 years old and a diehard Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And he carried his pre-transistor radio everywhere he went to make sure he wouldn't miss a game. When the Dodgers won, Mason cheered. When they lost, he cried. and blamed himself for not rooting hard enough. And in 1957, when the Dodgers moved to Los Angeles, 10-year-old Bob Mason was heartbroken. To punish the Dodgers for betraying him, he decided to become a Giants fan. But of course, the Giants moved from New York to San Francisco the same year as the Dodgers, and they would now be too far away to allow for live radio broadcasts across the country. From Mason in his love letter, published on radiosurvivor.com, quote, "An amazing radio technology combined with an amazing performance art saved me," end quote. The man who did these recreations was named Les Kiter, who, according to Mason, sat in a booth in Bermuda shorts eating popcorn out of a bag, receiving bare-bones transmissions from a telegrapher at the park. Kiter had no idea what the weather was like, who was in the stands, where players were positioned on the field, or exactly what was happening from play to play. From Mason, quote, "Kiter's language, his expressions and tangents and rigmarole, these authorial conceits, he had to make them all up. He couldn't afford to be constrained by reality, because reality was not forthcoming." End quote. Hyder and his engineer had a dozen different sound effects on tape to simulate a day at the ballpark, along with props. But for Bob Mason, it was much more than this. Quote, "He wasn't just announcing, he was reenacting. No, more than this, he was recreating, or actually creating a new representation of the game, in a newly created dimension of reality, all the while passing it off to his audience as the traditional game itself, the old ball game." End quote. Les Kiter was providing a sanctuary, a baseball haven that wouldn't have otherwise existed for adults and children like Bob Mason, who was, clearly from his article, forever grateful. Kiter and Arch McDonald and Ronald Reagan and hundreds of other imaginative broadcasters took this raw material of letters and numbers and wove them into 2-hour tapestries that were exciting and captivating and heartfelt and absolutely real to those who listened. But now, there are no surviving recordings of these types of recreations. And so, how fitting that they must reside entirely in our imaginations. We'll end tonight with a listener baseball story from Robert from California.
I'd missed an opening day since 1948. I even got fired from a job for just saying I'm going to the baseball game, and I think it's 70-something years now. That's my holiday.
That's one of your longest relationships, right? You and baseball.
Matter of fact, yeah. As of now, yeah. I had the games on the radio in 47. The announcer was a guy named Jack McDonald. He did the Seals home games, and the away games were recreations. I guess they used a little piece of wood or something to make the sound. I remember they had a loop for the crowd noise. It sounded to me like da 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 da, da, and it was really distinctive. The Seals and the Los Angeles Angels tied for the championship of the PCL when the Seals lost in the 8th inning to a home run, and I remember crying myself to sleep. I must have been 8, 9 years old. And then when the Giants got here, Russ Hodges came with the Giants. Russ Hodges' call was "Bye Bye Baby" for home runs. And that's still used on the Giants TV broadcasts to this day. When the Giants got here, it was a big deal. People all had their transistors. You heard about L.A. and Vin Scully being heard in the stadium. Well, the same thing was true here. You could sort of walk around and hear it. It was a big deal. You could walk around outside and hear the games on the radio. And I even remember being in the theater, and one of the actors, during a pause in the production, gave a Giants update score from the stage in the Curran Theater. I could get the LA station sometimes, but a guy across the street had a better radio than I, and he would put the LA game, the LA Dodgers, when they weren't playing the Giants, on the radio, and then he'd put his phone by it, and I would listen to the game on the phone on his radio. Here's a big moment for you. The Dodgers and the Giants had a playoff series, you believe, in 1951. I was in junior high school. The vice principal was we were a lot of big baseball fans then, and he took a TV set from someplace, brought it down into the auditorium, so on lunch hour, we could watch the game. And I recall watching Thompson's home run. At that time, I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan. After the home run, I had tears in my eyes out in the play yard. People were saying, "What's wrong?" I'd say, "Oh, just the sun's in my eyes." I guess when you're 12 or 13, you don't want to admit you're crying over a baseball game. I'm almost done watching baseball. Everything is bigger, better, louder. Everything is to make a buck. And it's driving me nuts. You go to the game, they overpower you. Scoreboard says make noise. Come on, give me a break. You got to be able to know when to make noise. And I'm just about done. I'll get through this season with the radio, and I say that now. We'll see what happens when next year rolls around.
Thanks so much, Robert, for these great memories. And I'll check in to see if you come back to baseball next year. In episode 5, we'll look at the battles waged: Major League Baseball versus radio, then radio versus television. And we'll answer the question why, after tape players and CDs and cable TV and internet and streaming, radio continues to endure, and in many ways remains the soul of the game. Next time on the Midnight Library of Baseball. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Music by Sergi Papkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay, and others at Artlist. Good night.